Okay, thank you. I'm Dr. Graham Pluck, and I'm going to present to you today on neuroscience and education, interactions of poverty, mind, brain, and education. Okay. I'm currently based at Chula University in Bangkok, Thailand, but I was for several years director of the Institute of Neurosciences at Universidad San Francisco de Quito. And I'm going to present some work that we did in Ecuador on the issue to do with education and neuroscience, particularly in relation to poverty and socioeconomic status. So let me begin. Now, I'm going to start, first of all, talking about socioeconomic status and how this relates to neurocognition. There are lots of environmental factors which could influence how well somebody's cognitive or brain function operates. Okay. We could have links between socioeconomic status and stress, or with nutrition, with mental illness, with healthcare, with educational access, with pollution, and things like vulnerability to violence. All of these will vary along a socioeconomic gradient and potentially affect brain function and cognitive function as well. So we could see some of these reasons as indicators that people of lower socioeconomic status may suffer less efficient cognitive development or issues with brain development. Okay. Now, there may also be genetic factors as well. About 50% of the variability in IQ scores is inherited. And so IQ scores and cognition to some extent allow socioeconomic mobility. So we would expect some mobility to be present so that perhaps people with better cognitive function would develop, would have a higher socioeconomic status. Okay. Now, we also know that major mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have genetic components, and they are also associated with cognitive impairment and downward socioeconomic mobility. So we might expect that there might be a genetic component for this aspect as well, which could influence the relationship between cognitive ability and socioeconomic status. Okay, sorry, I just need to. Now, we can't do this kind of research to find out what the effects are experimentally on humans, of course, because human research is always observational and this kind of thing. And as such experiments would not be possible. But there have been classic studies, for example, with rats that have shown that limited or enhanced environments cause differences in brain development. Now, the classic work on this was done by Rosenweg. Here we have an image of rats in a standard lab environment, or they could be put in an impoverished lab environment in which they have less access to toys and less to do and less to see, and they're isolated on their own. And now Rosenweg et al., they compared those rats with rats raised in an enriched lab environment. And in this case, they had toys to play with, that they had more space, and they had several other rats in the cage with them. Okay. Now, Rosenweg did 17 of these studies with different cohorts of rats, and it's 16 out of 17. They showed significant increases in cortex development in the rats raised in enriched environments. Okay, so we don't really want to make extensions of this to sort of socioeconomic status, but it does show that the environment and how stimulating the environment is can have quite significant influences on brain development. And you can see the image there in the graph. The red and the pink bars are significant effects found by Rosenberg. Now, with humans, we tend to use brain imaging studies, and it's more observational, of course. But we can do quasi-experimental studies. For example, children who have been raised in impoverished environments, such as international institutions for orphans. Okay, so this research reported by Hodel et al. They showed significant differences in hippocampal and prefrontal cortex between controls and 110 12 to 14-year-olds adopted from international institutions. Okay. So in general, it was probably a little better to have an early adoption into a stable family rather than a late adoption. But the data they found was mainly the fact that people were adopted into a family. They were people who had smaller hippocampus volumes, and they had somewhat smaller left and right prefrontal cortex volumes. Okay. They also looked at the amygdala, but found no effect. Now, the reason people look at the amygdala is this might be associated with sort of trauma or stress effects. Now, other people have found these effects. Now, when looking particularly at socioeconomic status and brain regional volumes, Nobel et al. Examined brain regions in relation to SES in a non-deprived sample of children and adolescents. So this was just a group of teenagers, basically, who came from varying backgrounds, some of them quite poor and some of them quite rich. They found that socioeconomic status was linked to both hippocampus and amygdala volumes. And they show the graphs here. There's correlations with the income to needs ratio and the hippocampal volume, and the years of parental education with the amygdala volume. And years of parental education is sort of a very good basic proxy measure of socioeconomic status. It's one of the common simple measures to use in this kind of research. So there is some evidence of the limbic system involved in socioeconomic variation. Okay. Now, what probably might be more interesting from a cognitive perspective, this is that SES was also found to interact with age on the volumes of the left superior temporal gyrus and the left inferior temporal gyrus. Now, these are both parts of the perisylvian language system, and so they're both closely linked to language use. And so this is research which suggests that with increasing age, there is increasing effect of language exposure, of socioeconomic status on development of language systems in the brain. Now, similar results have been found by Mertz et al., published only in 2020. Now, they used a naturalistic study. They recorded families and recorded how long the conversational turns were and how many adult word count were used by the children. And they found some quite significant effects around the perisylvian cortex on the left hemisphere again, positively correlating. And again, this is sort of the temporal lobe area, an area closely associated with language development. So that confirms, again, the language involvement of socioeconomic status. Now, this is Nobel et al. They have proposed that there are two main mechanisms by which socioeconomic status impacts on brain development and from there on cognitive development. And they suggest that one of these is the linguistic environment associated with socioeconomic status. And this may affect the left temporal lobe and occipital regions. And that leads to delays or differences in language development. They also proposed another mechanism of how stress associated with socioeconomic status may lead to hippocampus, amygdala, and anterior cingulate cortex alterations, and how these might affect cognitive abilities such as memory, social emotional processing, and cognitive control. We will return to the idea of stress later, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the linguistic environment and language development in children. Now, the first message I have here is that cognitive potential linked to SES is not fixed. Some of this data, when you show brain scans, you show physiological information, it seems to show a sort of deterministic perspective, but that's not really true. There is lots of potential for cognitive development, even in challenging socioeconomic status situations. Okay. The first point of evidence I would like to present here is that the brain is basically a learning machine, and cognitive processes change with experiences. Now, this is a very old graph. This is one of the basic sort of images you will see in a memory textbook and neuropsychology textbook. And it shows some of the different types of memory that humans have. But the interesting thing, I think, is if you look at the brain regions associated with the different memory systems, we've got the medial temporal lobe, the striatum in the basal ganglia, the neocortex, amygdala, cerebellum, and also the reflex pathways, which would include spinal cord. So actually, it's covering a huge amount of the nervous system. And if a huge amount of the nervous system is involved in memory processes and learning, then a huge amount of the nervous system is plastic and available for development. Now, on a more practical note, general cognitive ability linked to SES can be improved. We know this from studies of adoption. And when children move from lower SES families, lower socioeconomic status families, into higher socioeconomic status families through adoption, there is a large increase in their IQ scores, the range of 12 to 18 points. Okay, so this is a very big increase. To increase one's IQ by 18 points it's very substantial. So it shows that even children who have been in very challenging environments do have the potential to develop much higher levels in the right circumstances. Another example is Dr. Mario Capecchi, who was awarded the 2007 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. And he was actually a street child from ages 4 to 9 during World War II. And this is just a quote from him. Age 4.5, I started to live on the streets of Bolzano and just kept migrating south. Nobody was able to give me any food, so you just had to steal. The people got to know you, made things very unpleasant, and you had to move on. I went in a straight line south through Verona, then to Reggio Emilia, where my mother eventually found me. So even a child who was technically, effectively a street child was able to go on and develop and become so successful he was awarded a Nobel Prize. So I think this is a great example of the potential, particularly of education, to improve cognitive ability. There's also many examples in the in the published literature of high-level cognitive abilities seeming to be actually better in people living in difficult circumstances, particularly children. So one example I have here is homeless Bolivian children perform better than non-homeless children on this test of creativity. So this is like, for example, when they are asked to say, tell me alternative uses for a key, or tell me alternative uses for a paper clip. And it's usually considered to be a test of creative thinking, and homeless children are better than not homeless children on that. Similarly, another test of switching, this time an executive function test, was found to be performed much better by poor South African children compared to middle-class Australian children. Okay. So something about their environment and the situation they lived in, and how their responsibilities in the home and how they used to work probably drove their cognitive development, the high-level cognitive development. And finally, on this issue, neglected children may perform better than non-abused children on this planning test. This is the Towers test. It's a very famous test of executive functions. And so something about the experience of being neglected seemed to improve the planning ability of children. So how we develop our high-level cognitive abilities seem to be very linked to the actual specific experiences we have, which makes a lot of potential available for us. No. Probably the most interesting piece of evidence, I think, here is that for each year spent in education, IQ increases by about 3 points. Now, it's very difficult to get to the cause and effect of this, but the detailed analysis seems to suggest that education does cause the increase in IQ scores. And that's quite substantial. To be able to improve your IQ by 3 points for every year you stay in education is quite a meaningful amount. And we combine this with the fact that better cognitive ability has only positive impacts on life. A recent study published this year found that whatever thing you look at, being more intelligent is associated with being more sort of successful in terms of marriage stability, job stability, income, health. All measures are associated with better cognitive function. So really, it is better to be more intelligent, and the way we can achieve that is by receiving more education. Now, this leads me to my message 2. Cognitive abilities are not uniformly influenced by SES variation. Now, we saw this image earlier, and this is by Nobel et al., and they suggest the linguistic environment is particularly important and how that might affect temporal lobe development and how that might lead to differences in language development. And in fact, the language development seems to be incredibly important in this issue. This was a piece of research published by Farrow et al. A few years ago, and they looked at 10 to 13-year-olds, and they compared 30 low socioeconomic status children with 30 middle socioeconomic status children. And they tested them on eight cognitive domains linked to 8 different brain systems. So what they looked at tests which they considered to be related to perisylvian function, left perisylvian function, so the language system. They looked at tests they thought would be associated with prefrontal function and memory, working memory function. They looked at areas to do with medial prefrontal and cognitive control. They looked at tests which they thought would measure reward processing associated with orbitofrontal prefrontal. They looked at standard declarative memory measures, which they said would be associated with the medial temporal lobe function, and also spatial cognition and visual cognition, sort of basic object recognition. So this is like the distinction between parietal lobe processing and occipitotemporal processing. Now, effect sizes are shown in this graph, indicating how the middle SES kids performed better than the low SES kids. And clearly we can see that language function was much more affected by SES variation than any of the other abilities. And then following that, it's sort of working memory, executive function, and declarative memory. Excuse me. But the message, I think, from this is how important language development is and how richer children develop language much more than poorer children. Now, this is some of our own research. In the Ecuadorian context, this is a study of 132 students in Riobamba and Quito. And we use the same idea as Martha Farah in the previous study. We divided the cognitive system into 4 different dichotomies, and they gave us 8 different basic neurocognitive systems. So we looked at object recognition and visuospatial processing, declarative memory and procedural memory, language and spatial attention, and cool and hot executive functions. And I'll just go through these briefly. There's a distinction in cognitive neuroscience between the what and the what and the how pathways in the visual system, and the what pathway goes sort of occipitotemporal, and the how pathway goes occipitoparietal. We measured this with an object recognition task. We simply had to decide which 2 of the shapes are the same. That was an occipitotemporal test, and we used a 3-dimensional block design task, which is very sort of spatial and particularly involves parietal lobe functioning. We also looked at declarative memory and procedural memory, and these again use different systems in the brain. We looked at probabilistic classification as a procedural memory system, process related to basal ganglia function, and we use recognition as a declarative memory system, a declarative memory process related to the medial temporal lobe systems. The 3rd dichotomy was language and spatial attention. And this is based on the neuropsychological observation that damage to the left perisylvian system causes language disruption, but damage to the right perisylvian system causes spatial attention problems. And so we included, for the left hemisphere system, the Northwestern anagram test, and for the right hemisphere system, we used a gap detection task, which is commonly used to detect spatial biases in neuropsychological contexts. Now, the final dichotomy that we applied was between cool executive and hot executive functions. Now, cool executive functions are the traditional executive functions like working memory, impulse control, and switching. And to do this, we used the design fluency task. And this should be associated with dorsolateral prefrontal processing. On the other hand, to measure hot executive functions, these are executive functions which have an emotional component to them. We use the Iowa gambling task, in which people have to play a task in sort of to win play money. And that's quite well associated with orbitofrontal function. And so with these 8 tasks, we were able to sort of divide the brain basically into 8 different cognitive systems. Now, when we looked at how these systems relate to SES, to socioeconomic status in Ecuadorian adults. We found a larger correlation between language ability and SES scores. We found a reasonable correlation between declarative memory and also procedural memory and SES scores, and also with cool executive function. That was the design fluency task. And these are actually pretty similar, even though we used university students. We found very similar results that reported by Farah et al. And they've been using these with kindergarten children and school children, in which they find language, working memory, and declarative memory to be particularly associated with socioeconomic status gradients. So I think it's interesting that it's not just a childhood phenomenon, it carries on into adulthood, into early adulthood. Now, we were also interested in whether language is the underlying factor. So what we did, we covaried language scores out of the association between socioeconomic status and declarative memory and executive function. And when we do these, those positive correlations disappear. They all become non-significant. And this suggests to me that the underlying effect is actually a language effect, which has some knock-on effect on declarative memory, procedural memory, and executive function. But the basic consequence of variation in socioeconomic status is on language development. Okay, so I have some further evidence for this, again from Ecuador, and this is 110 adolescents. And again, we use the design fluency test again as a measure of executive function. I didn't explain it properly before, but the task is simply just to join the dots together to make a different design, and then to keep going and make as many different designs as you can without repeating yourself. So that's elements of working memory and initiation and fluency. And we also use the tower test, which is a classic test of executive function, and probably measures mainly planning ability. So we use those with the adolescents. We also included some more emotional tests, what we might call sort of hot theory of mind test. In fact, sort of related to theory of mind. And one of the tests we used was the reading the mind in the eyes test. I think in Spanish it's the test de miradas. And the person has to look at the eyes in the photo and pick which of the different thoughts he thinks the person has. So in this case, the correct answer would be asustado. And it's sort of a difficult test of emotion recognition and theory of mind processing. Now, what we found in our Ecuadorian sample here was a very large correlation of vocabulary with socioeconomic status. Again, language coming out as the biggest effect. There were some medium to large correlations of executive function and theory of mind with socioeconomic status. There were significant effects around the area of sort of 3.36, 0.32, 0.38. However, again, when we control for language ability statistically, there is no link between socioeconomic status and executive function or theory of mind ability. Our conclusion in this research was that language ability underlies the socioeconomic status effect on cognition. Okay, so a second message. Okay. language development may be a core issue linking socioeconomic status and cognitive ability. Now, I've returned to this image by Nobel because I think it's quite a useful way to interpret things. We've dealt kind of with the linguistic environment, which Nobel identifies, but they also propose that stress may be an important factor leading to changes in the brain, which have implications for memory, social, emotional processing, and cognitive control or self-regulation. And I think what they're trying to say here is that lower socioeconomic status families may be under greater stress, and that stress, probably mediated through cortisol, will have effects on the limbic system, such as the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, cortisol is an interesting hormone to study in this context, because cortisol levels give an indication of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activity and of psychological stress. Now, cortisol is released by the adrenals and it prepares the body for psychological stresses, but it can be harmful over the long term. Now, we can measure cortisol in many ways, but one way to do it is to measure in hair samples. So you take a sample of hair from a person's head, and in a 3 centimeter sample of hair, we can estimate chronic stress exposure over the past 3 months, because hair grows at about 1 centimeter each month. So we can, with a 3 centimeter sample of hair, we can see how much cortisol the person has been exposed to in the past 3 months. Okay, so we included this in a subsample of our adolescents at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito, and these were adolescents aged 12 to 17. So we took samples from them and we processed them in the labs at the university to extract levels of cortisol. And we expected to find a negative correlation, so that people with higher socioeconomic status had less circulating cortisol levels. In fact, we found no link between cortisol and socioeconomic status. Now, some people have made this connection, but we're not the only ones who weren't able to find it. Other researchers have similarly failed to detect such an association. For example, Hackman et al. 2012. So personally, I sort of doubt that maybe that the stress and cortisol issue is that important in comparison to the other effect that we've all talked about, and that's on language development. Now, I wanted to return to the relevance to education here. Now, the reason it's important to think about this in educational context is that intelligence test scores and academic achievements are quite well correlated. At school level, the correlation between general intelligence and GPA is about 0.5, which is a fairly strong correlation. It's technically a large correlation. The correlation in university is only about 0.2. That's not so important, I think. And perhaps at university level, students are not as dependent on their own cognitive abilities, but they are probably dependent on their own motivation and determination and personality to achieve. But nevertheless, it is important at school level. Okay. So what is the cause of the lower language ability in lower-SES children? Now, many studies point to access to printed written material, access in the home. Many studies have revealed that in higher socioeconomic status families. In richer families, you find more printed material, more books and magazines, and you find less in poorer families, in the homes of poorer families. And this has been well reported. It's a well-known phenomenon. But school can remove that disparity, creating equality of opportunity. So even if children are living in homes which don't have any books, they can still be exposed to reading material and improve their language skills while at school. Now, importantly, I think for the current issue is that children drop in their reading ability and language skill during the summer break. Okay, so this is a well-known phenomenon, the summer loss, and it particularly affects reading and language skills. And that drop is biggest for children from low socioeconomic status families. In fact, the socioeconomic status effect on reading is almost completely created during summer breaks from school. So this is really quite an important point. If schools did not have a summer break, the difference between rich and poor children on reading ability would be removed. Okay, that's really quite an important thing to be aware of. Now, why is that so important for us to talk about today? Well, we have had a lot of school closures during the pandemic. Okay. UNICEF reported in March 2021 that over 168 million children globally have experienced school closures for almost an entire year. Okay, so this is unprecedented to have so many children missing a whole year of education. 214 million children globally, or 1 in 7, had missed more than 3/4 of their in-person learning in that year. Now, I think it's interesting that the longest closures were in low and middle income countries, and particularly the worst affected were Panama, El Salvador, Bangladesh, and Bolivia. And of course, 3 of those countries are Latin American countries. So the school closures have been more dramatic in many Latin American countries, and they've probably affected the poor people in those countries much more severely than they have in some other countries. Okay. Now, there is quite a lot of research already reported on the effect of school closures on formal learning. Closure of schools was only 8 weeks in the Netherlands, okay? But a study of 350,000 children found they made no progress during that period, despite remote learning by their teachers. And the researchers also found that poor students were affected 60% more than richer students. Again, echoing what I said earlier, that absence from school seems to affect poor children much more than it does richer children. School closures in the USA were longer for schools which had lots of low-performing ethnic minority, non-native English speaking, or homeless students. Again, this is affecting the poor children more than the richer children. And dropout rates of poor students in low-income countries are expected to increase 6 to 9% due to the pandemic. So we're facing a lot more school dropouts than ever before. Okay. Now, the conclusions I have here really are that poverty has a strong influence on brain and cognitive development. However, education is a powerful method to improve cognitive function. It's probably the most powerful method that we have to actually improve somebody's cognitive ability. I've reviewed research which suggests language development may be the core issue. This is the core issue which is affecting other cognitive abilities. So although children in poorer families may have worse executive functioning or worse declarative memory, it may be caused by the not developing language quite as well as richer children. This is important because during the pandemic, children from poor families have been disproportionately affected, particularly for language skill development. So the pandemic will have damaged language development more than anything else, probably. And language development seems to be the core issue, which may be holding back some children from poorer families and stopping them from achieving as much as they might otherwise do. Okay. So this is an important, very important issue. We may be seeing a whole generation of poorer children or children and adolescents in poorer families who are not going to develop to the potential they would have. And potentially the gap between the richer and the poorer children in terms of cognitive abilities is going to be much larger now than it ever has been before, than it has been recently anyway. Okay. So that's my conclusions. Thank you for listening to me today. It's been a pleasure to present to you. I'm here at the conference so we can have some questions. And so I'm happy to answer questions on any of the issues I've talked about, anything else you think might be interesting.